So in 1977, a young up-and-coming filmmaker made a sci-fi classic that changed cinema forever. And we're going to talk about the other one. Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Now, Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out in 1977, was directed by Steven Spielberg, who was best friends with George Lucas at the time, and they both had a sci-fi movie coming out the same year. Spielberg, of course, had Close Encounters, and George Lucas had Star Wars. And you can imagine which one was the bigger hit, because, I mean, Star Wars is just massive. It was a massive success, and I kind of feel bad for Close Encounters in a way, because Close Encounters isn't a bad movie, but I feel like the legacy of it has been completely eclipsed by both the success of Star Wars and Spielberg's later work on E.T., kind of tackling the same subject matter, but from a kid's point of view. But looking back on Close Encounters, it is an interesting movie because it's told from an adult perspective. It's a family. It's kind of middle-class suburbia like E.T., but instead of focusing on the kids, it's focusing on Richard Dreyfuss as a grown man with a family, and he's dealing with this stuff that is completely beyond his capacity. And while this movie is good, it's got great special effects, it's got some really epic moments, especially towards the end. I do understand why this movie was not nearly as popular as Star Wars or E.T., because both of those movies are pretty lighthearted, they're fun for the whole family. And while Close Encounters is still pretty much fun for the whole family, I mean, it's not rated R or anything, there's nothing that objectionable in it. It does have more of an adult audience. It takes its time a lot more, the pacing is a bit slower, a bit more drawn out when you're following every step of the progression of these different encounters from these aliens that are just hidden here and there and everywhere. And as the movie goes along, you get more government agencies involved, you get more people noticing that there's a pattern to these things. And that's most of the movie. It's an investigation, it's a mystery. You just see some of these characters start going insane. And the movie has kind of a downbeat energy to it. There's a lot of domestic arguing and conflict with Richard Dreyfuss and his family. And you see this obsession, this mania, driving a wedge between him and his family. Which brings me to another criticism that I have about this movie. It doesn't ruin the movie for me, and I still find a lot of enjoyment. But I feel like another reason why this movie didn't really catch on with audiences back in the day and still hasn't really found an audience aside from really nerdy sci-fi people like myself is the overall message is a little confused. I don't think the ending quite sticks the landing, because this is very much a Spielberg in his 20s movie. This is Spielberg when he was a young man. He was fresh in the industry. He was obsessed with making movies. He was loving what he was doing. Even though it was consuming his whole life, he was still just doing what he loved. He was obsessed with it, as a lot of directors are. He's obsessed with this one thing. He's got a mission, and he's going to see it through to the end, and he's going to ride off into the sunset with his newfound purpose in life. And that's really the story of Close Encounters. And on the surface, it seems perfectly fine, perfectly reasonable on an emotional level that would be the course that he goes through. But then you realize that, no, he's got a family, and he's got kids, and he just leaves them behind. He never comes back for them. He just goes where his obsession takes him, and it's almost hailed as a heroic act, as a virtuous act. Yeah, I just don't see that resonating as much with the adults that have adopted that kind of familial responsibility, because even Spielberg himself has said that he would have never written it that way, knowing what he knows now about fatherhood and family. It's clearly where he was at that time, which kind of makes the movie naive in a way. It doesn't bring the weight and responsibility that a lot of his other movies have. A lot of his movies later on will really emphasize the family unit and keeping that strong. I mean, look at Poltergeist that Spielberg wrote and was incredibly involved in, that had a lot of the same ideas as Close Encounters, but done with a more supernatural twist to it. The moral to that story is the reconciliation of the family, and that's why I think Poltergeist ultimately is a better movie, because it really lands the plane on that message. But aside from that, and I wanted to get it out of the way early, Close Encounters is still a fascinating watch, because it really takes its time building up the atmosphere, the toll it's taking on the family, the toll it's taking on the different individuals slowly losing their mind over these visions that they're getting. And even the designs of the alien spaceships, for a long time in this movie, you never really get a good look at these spaceships. Kind of like what he did with Jaws, you have that prolonged suspense where you don't really know what you're looking at. You don't get a good look at it. All you see are these really bright lights that are moving in ways that are just not human, flying around, giving people sunburn, which is a really unique approach. I can't really think of another alien abduction movie where the light from the spaceship is so intense and so bright that it'll actually burn your skin. And it's played in such a natural and realistic way where you don't even question it. You know it's some kind of alien technology, it's some kind of new energy source, possibly radiation based. You don't really know, it's not really explained, but it gives you enough to know that this is definitely alien and potentially dangerous, because that's a whole nother side to this story. You have these government agencies that don't trust these spaceships. They're completely out of their depth when it comes to understanding this phenomena, and you see everybody kind of come together as the movie goes along to have this final confrontation with the mothership on top of the Devil's Tower. And that scene, oh my goodness. But before we get to that, I don't want to gloss over some of these other iconic scenes that I feel like a lot of people forget are even in this movie. For instance, there's this other woman that has a similar experience to Richard Dreyfuss's character. Her son gets abducted from her house. And the scene where the abduction is happening is straight out of Poltergeist. It is a horrifying scene. It's suspenseful. You see the screws coming undone. You see all these little things happening at first that are just a little weird. And then the light show kicks on. You see the door open, the light shooting in, the kid getting abducted. It's surprisingly intense. And especially now that Spielberg has kind of moved away from his more horror-based roots like Jaws, Poltergeist, Close Encounters. Even the early Indiana Jones movies had plenty of horror influence in them. This is another example that Spielberg at a time wasn't afraid to shock and horrify his audience, get them to jump out of their seat or white-knuckle the chair with anticipation. And it's a style that I would love to see him revisit, because I haven't seen anything even remotely horror-based from him since War of the Worlds, and that was the very early 2000s. But it seems like that show he can really do whatever genre he wants. If he wants to do kid-friendly, fair, fine. If he wants to do a musical, if he wants to do an adventure, he's got complete mastery over film language. He knows exactly how to deliver whatever that scene demands. And there's so many scenes in this movie like that where they feel like they're microcosms of a style that is still being formed. Spielberg was still pretty green when he was making this movie. He was still trying out a lot of new stuff. And there's some scenes that are incredibly grounded in character dialogue and tension, like the arguments between Richard Dreyfuss and Terry Garr, who plays his wife. And then there's scenes like the one I just talked about that are straight up horror. And there's still other scenes like when Richard Dreyfuss is messing around with his kids that feel like something like E.T., like a family-friendly, suburban, wholesome comedy. There's actually quite a few comedic moments sprinkled throughout this movie, like the scene at the dinner table when he's making the Devil's Tower out of his mashed potatoes and he's just in a trance, not paying attention to everybody else. And yes, that scene is why I'm releasing this right before Thanksgiving. So happy Thanksgiving, everybody. For me, this counts as a Thanksgiving movie. There's not many to choose from, so this is it this year. Well, Close Encounters definitely has its problems on the macro storytelling level. When you actually sit down to watch the movie, it is enjoyable. There's a lot of really good scenes, really well shot and acted and directed scenes in here that make the experience of watching the movie way more enjoyable, even if the big picture doesn't always stick the landing. And speaking of sticking the landing, now we got to talk about the climax of this movie, because throughout this whole movie, you're getting little pieces of information here and there. You're seeing some weird things. You're seeing some examples of spaceships flying around. You're hearing that 5-note melody throughout the whole movie through different configurations. And all that helps to build up this great mystery of what do these aliens want? What do they look like? What are they here for? What kind of aliens are they? Are they friendly? Are they monstrous? Are they here to kill everybody? What's going on? And then you see it. You see the government and all their agencies are there. The scientists are there, especially French New Wave director that I can never remember his name, trying to figure out what to do. Richard Dreyfuss is there. They're all there to witness history being made. And you're like, okay, how are they going to communicate with this thing? Because it probably doesn't speak English. And that's absolutely the case. So they do it through music, through the synth notes that we've heard throughout the entire movie. And then the aliens respond. That moment is probably one of the best moments in cinema history ever. That dialogue through song between the government and the mothership, that scene alone is enough to make the hair on the back of your neck stand up, make you lean in, make you really care about this movie. You might not have really cared about all the domestic stuff, the government conspiracy stuff, the everything leading up to this moment, but as soon as that mothership speaks, everybody in the audience cares, and it just got real, because now the mothership opens and the aliens come out. And this is where, depending on the version that you've seen, it varies drastically. I'm pretty sure there's 3 different cuts of this movie out there. There's the theatrical version, there's the special edition, and then I think there's the director's cut, which was Spielberg's final cut to this movie. I guess Spielberg had shot a bunch of stuff that ultimately the studio's like, we don't need this, we don't need this, we don't need this. And it really kind of made him upset. So a few years later, when he finally got the clout to really be like, okay, I want a director's cut, I want a special edition re-released, and we're going to put all this extra footage in there, and we're going to see more of the aliens. I guess the studio wasn't quite on board, because they're like, well, we need something to really sell this special edition. We need something big to really promote it with. And their idea was, well, let's just show what the inside of that spaceship looks like. That's the big mystery still lingering at the end of the movie. When Richard Dreyfuss goes inside, what does he see? And Spielberg didn't really like that idea, because he loved the ambiguity of that ending. But that was the only way he was going to get it re-released, so he said, fine, whatever, and then they released it. And then a few more years later, Spielberg had a lot more clout. He's made a bunch more hits, so then they finally let him release his version of the movie, which had all the extra scenes, but cut the inside of the spaceship. So I'm pretty sure those are the 3 main differences between the versions. And for me, I think Spielberg was right. His director's cut is the best. It's got a lot of great character scenes that were cut from the theatrical version, and you see a little bit more of the aliens. You see what I'm gonna call the little green men. They're the short, stubby aliens that are walking out first, and then you have this really tall, regal alien that looks like a Kaminoan from Attack of the Clones. And while the effects on the puppetry of it aren't the best, it is really cool to see that design. It's a really original design until George Lucas stole it for Attack of the Clones. And it does give you a really satisfying reveal to end the movie on before Richard Dreyfuss goes inside the spaceship, never to be seen again. And speaking of him walking into the spaceship, I already kind of mentioned my issues on a thematic and family level, why that ending doesn't quite work with him just walking into the sunset. I do actually like it symbolically. You could look at this as how a man chases his mania to the fulfillment of it and the ultimate satisfaction and relief when he actually reaches the thing that he's been searching for throughout that whole journey. Or you could look at the aliens as angelic beings, as almost a religious allegory, which I don't think is entirely coincidental. I think if you look at this movie from that lens, you'll see a couple interesting things. But I think that the inciting incident of this happening at the railroad tracks, which could be interpreted as him either dying or having a near-death experience, having him be physically marked up from that experience, and then having him find other people who've had similar experiences and kind of bonding over that shared experience. And then from a production design standpoint, having the aliens be represented by these bright lights that just come and go as they please. And then having Richard Dreyfuss walk into the light at the end of the movie could symbolize him going to heaven, having him actually die at the end. There's a lot of different ways you can look at this movie from that more religious side. And stuff like this where I don't completely write this movie off as just being a stepping stone for Spielberg moving on to bigger and better things later in his career. Because there's a lot that can be dissected and unpacked from this movie by people a lot smarter than me. They're just looking at visual cues, symbolism. Again, the fact that the climax of the movie is all happening at this big mountain that could represent Olympus or Mount Sinai. In fact, when you see the mothership descending on this mountain, it actually does look an awful lot like Mount Sinai from the Ten Commandments movie. A movie that I know was a big influence on Spielberg. In fact, he basically remade that movie through DreamWorks with Prince of Egypt, so I'm not sure that that was a coincidence either. So to wrap this up, Close Encounters is kind of a mixed bag for me. There are some things that I wish were a little tighter in the script. I wish the narrative had a bit more thrust to it. Because Spielberg is still a pretty young director here, his style is not cemented in a way that perfectly flows from scene to scene. Some of the scene transitions feel a little abrupt. Some of the style changes from scene to scene do feel a little disjointed here and there. But ultimately, this is a very entertaining movie. If you don't go in expecting Star Wars or even E.T., if you just want an interesting, thought-provoking science fiction story that feels on par with something like Twilight Zone, where you may not get all the answers, but it'll get you thinking, this is the movie for you. It's a movie I'll pop in from time to time, and I'll always finish the movie finding something new that I didn't notice or didn't appreciate the last time I watched it. But now I turn it over to you guys. What do you think about Close Encounters of the Third Kind? Do you consider it an honorary Thanksgiving movie like I do? But whatever you think, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my Nerdy Talk, and I'll see you in the next video.